5 years ago, we asked what topic you'd like to learn more about on its own dedicated SciShow channel, and you said psychology. So in the years since, we've done our best to answer your burning psychology questions. But we have some big news. SciShow Psych will be going on hiatus after this video. We're sad to say goodbye for now, but excited to spend more time making videos about the fascinating world of science over on our main channel. And we'll keep making videos about psychology there, so keep an eye out for those. The videos that exist on this channel will also stay up, so you can watch them anytime. So for the last video, at least for a while, we've compiled some of your top burning questions that we've answered based on popularity. Starting with the question, why do people throw temper tantrums? If you've spent time with a toddler, you've probably experienced the sound and the fury of a temper tantrum. You know, the kind where a tiny child morphs into a wailing volcano of seemingly unbridled rage. But recent research shows there's much more going on, and we can learn a lot from temper tantrums, especially when it comes to what toddlers actually think and feel. And that means we can use tantrums as a tool to help support kids' healthy development. When a toddler throws a tantrum, it's basically their brain's threat detection system working overtime. So there's a lot going on in their amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing big feelings, and in their hypothalamus, the brain center that controls unconscious things like heart rate and body temperature. And that would actually be all fine and dandy if it weren't for the fact that their prefrontal cortex, the part that helps regulate emotions and behaviors, isn't fully developed. So when a toddler totally loses it because their socks are the wrong color, it's because they literally can't control their overwhelming feelings yet. Now, historically, researchers thought that those overwhelming feelings were just one emotion: anger. They literally defined tantrums as violent outbursts of rage. In fact, a diagnostic text from 1937 went as far as to describe tantrums as the strong desire to disturb, destroy, annoy, or annihilate. And this idea that toddlers were just unpredictable rage monsters informed a lot of parenting strategies over the years, even though it's wrong. Like, experts actually suggested splashing kids with cold water to cool their fury, which, for the record, is a terrible idea. By the 1990s, psychologists realized that there are actually two distinct emotions involved in temper tantrums: anger and sadness, which matters because the ways of helping a child through those emotions can differ. For instance, an angry toddler may not want to be comforted, while a sad toddler may not respond well to being left alone. But even then, the prevailing idea was that one emotion flowed from the other. Like, kids would start angry and end up sad, or vice versa. So, the best response to a tantrum would depend on what stage of it the kid was in, though no one could agree on which emotion was first. More recently, psychologists have come to realize that tantrums are much more complex because toddlers actually experience a range of emotions and emotional intensities, and they're feeling all those feels at the same time. From an article published in Emotion in 2011, scientists used onesies outfitted with microphones to study whether toddlers' vocalizations, like screams and whines, could shed more light on the emotional component of tantrums. In all, they analyzed almost 1,300 vocalizations from 24 tantrums and found that toddlers expressed different levels of anger and sadness at different audio frequencies. They used lower frequency, quieter vocalizations when they were feeling sad. And when they became angry, their vocalizations increased in both energy and frequency. They also saw that the pattern of the frequencies over time was different for different emotions. Sad sounds peaked in the middle, while angry ones spiked at the beginning. These unique patterns allow the researchers to track the timing of emotions throughout tantrums. And rather than feeling one or the other, the little ones express both sadness and anger basically the whole time. So not only do a toddler's screams communicate how angry or sad they are, those emotions are more intertwined and simultaneous than we used to think. All of this means that comforting a child during a tantrum is kind of hard, but listening can help caregivers make sure they're responding to a child's emotions in the most effective way. Another tried and true tactic is to stay as calm as possible, because that actually helps calm them down. Researchers aren't completely sure why, but some think it has to do with mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons that light up when we mirror or mimic an action that's being performed by another person. So, they get activated while you're trying to follow your yoga teacher's movements, for instance. And while even neuroscientists still don't know a ton about how they work, Psychological researchers think that they could also play a role in emotional mimicry. Essentially, when a toddler sees someone being calm, their mirror neurons might kick in and tell them to mimic that calmness. Whereas if you get heated, you could be subconsciously telling their brains to dial things up. Plus, keeping a cool head is key to being there for a toddler who needs help navigating the roller coaster of anger and sadness they're feeling. That's because staying calm helps you make better choices. When a toddler's behavior makes us angry, we're more likely to make rash decisions that don't fix the situation. In fact, these can make things worse. Meanwhile, by keeping calm and observing toddlers' tantrum behavior, we can pick up on signs that a kiddo might need extra help with handling their emotions. For example, while tantrums are a perfectly normal part of a toddler's development, toddlers that have lots of long, destructive tantrums may have an underlying mood or disruptive behavior disorder. And diagnosing and treating these early in life can help kids have better outcomes. So when we understand toddlers' temper tantrums, we can use them to help support kids' healthy development. And while knowing the why behind a toddler tantrum might not make it any easier to get through, remember, they're just trying to figure out this human emotion stuff. And that's hard, even for adults, right? So temper tantrums might be managed better by developing emotional intelligence. But what about other kinds of intelligence? How would we go about measuring those? Here's Hank to answer the next burning question. Does IQ really measure how smart people are?
When people talk about smarts, intelligence quotient, or IQ, always seems to come up. People love to bring up how Einstein had a genius-level IQ of 160, and to join Mensa, you need to have an IQ of at least 130. But is IQ even a good way to measure intelligence? Well, that depends on how you define intelligence. IQ scores may be a useful shorthand to talk about education strategies for big groups of people, like when discussing public policy. But IQ can be affected by a lot of factors, even things as subjective as your motivation while taking the test. The first sort of IQ test was invented by the French psychologist Alfred Binet in the early 1900s. A law in 1882 aimed at egalitarianism said that any healthy child had to go to school and learn the basics, like reading, writing, arithmetic, history, public policy, and the natural sciences. The law even included a special consideration for children with disabilities, like deafness or blindness. But the French government acknowledged that not every kid would be able to keep up with a normal curriculum, for lots of possible reasons. So Binet and other psychologists were commissioned to create a standardized test to measure how different kids handled their schoolwork. Along with Théodore Simon, Binet developed the Binet-Simon test, in which children would answer a series of questions until they couldn't anymore. That way, kids could be grouped in classes with students with similar scores, instead of relying on their age or the subjective judgments of teachers. In the next decade or so, this scale was revised for use with both kids and adults and renamed the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scales. This popular IQ test is still used today, along with other standardized tests that are meant to measure learning ability, sometimes defined as how quickly and easily we learn new things. On early versions of the test, IQ was calculated by taking a person's score on a standardized test, dividing it by their chronological age, and then multiplying the result by 100. In more modern versions, you're basically ranked against other test takers. The scores of a group of people are scaled so that 100 is the average, and your IQ score is determined based on where you are in relation to that average. But here's the thing, whether or not IQ tests actually measure your intelligence depends on how you're defining intelligence. In simple definitions, intelligence is the ability to learn new things or adapt to new situations. But the definition can also include the ability to use logic or reason or to think abstractly. These definitions are all focused on intellectual capacity, which is how intelligence is defined by the American Psychological Association. And they don't include other kinds of intelligence, like social or emotional intelligence, or things like creativity or self-awareness. The Stanford-Binet test, for instance, focuses on testing 5 main categories of information: baseline knowledge, basic mathematics, visualizing objects in space, working memory, and fluid reasoning, or the ability to solve new problems. So depending on what you're trying to understand about someone, IQ tests might be useful, or they might be a waste of time. It turns out that your IQ score can be affected by a lot of different things, and because intelligence is so complex, we're not sure how strongly different factors might affect it. There's some evidence that says cognitive abilities are somewhat heritable, meaning there might be some kind of genetic component to IQ, but it's not that simple. Recent studies have shown that IQ tests are affected by motivation. For example, one 2011 meta-analysis found that people who are offered cash if they do well on an IQ test scored higher than people who weren't offered anything, like up to 20 points higher for just a $10 reward. That is a huge effect. And we know that motivation can play a role in other things, like your grades and your career path, that could be wrongly chalked up to just an IQ score. IQ also seems to be affected by environmental factors. Cultural values can influence your IQ scores. For example, a kid who grows up in a community that prizes storytelling might do better on verbal sections of the test, or problems that require you to remember and reuse information. How much education you get and the quality of that education may have an effect too. Kids who miss school because it's hard for them to get there, or who attend schools without many resources, tend to score lower than their peers. Even your family environment can affect your IQ, like whether you grow up in a low-income household or whether you experience a lot of trauma as a kid. So like a lot of things, IQ seems to result from a mix of nature and nurture. There are just so many factors that affect your learning ability as you grow up, from the environment you develop in before you're born to things like education opportunities and family dynamics. But psychologists seem to agree that one thing that seems to help people with learning and academic achievement is thinking about intelligence as a thing that can change. So IQ tests aren't anywhere near perfect or comprehensive, but they can help us predict how people might learn in the near future, which can make a difference in the support they receive. For instance, IQ scores can affect diagnosis of intellectual disability, which can inform public policy about education programs to support different students. It's understandable why it's valuable to have a standard way to sort of measure intelligence, like when it comes to making these general policy decisions. But it's also easy to see why IQ tests have been surrounded in controversy too. There's a lot we don't understand about intelligence, and a lot that an IQ score can't tell us about a person or groups of people. So while IQ can be a useful shorthand in some cases, it is not something that is set in stone, and do not let a number define you.
So intelligence is complicated, and different people learn differently. Our brains themselves are super complicated, and that can lead to different people experiencing day-to-day life differently. So that brings us to burning question number 3. How is ADHD connected to sleep?
Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, otherwise known as ADHD, is a complex condition. The inability to pay sustained attention to things can really cause problems when you're trying to go about your day-to-day. But it's not just focusing that's an issue. It's really common for those with ADHD to have trouble sleeping, too. And that's actually created a chicken and egg question among researchers. Does ADHD lead to sleep problems in some people, or do sleep problems lead to ADHD symptoms, or a bit of both? The relationship between ADHD and sleep has been a feature of ADHD research for years. Scientists and doctors have long received complaints from patients that they're just not able to get to sleep at the right time. And research has backed this up. For example, a study from 2008 found that up to 70% of kids with an ADHD diagnosis have issues falling and staying asleep. That's a way bigger chunk than in the general population. And in adults with ADHD, studies have shown that 78% have delayed circadian rhythm, something that happens in just 20% of the population without ADHD. Circadian rhythms are the hormonal cycles that keep our body clock in tune with the natural cycle of night and day. And if this rhythm is delayed, it means that events that would happen at a certain time of day, like getting sleepy, start to happen later on. That means that many adults with ADHD are falling asleep later and sleeping for shorter amounts of time. And anyone that's ever pulled an all-nighter can tell you a night without enough sleep can make things a whole lot harder the next day. A 2008 study showed that in kids with ADHD, moderate to severe sleep issues were associated with poorer outcomes, as well as causing problems for their families day-to-day, like getting to work and school on time. It's not always just falling asleep late either. Many of those with ADHD also experience sleep disorders such as sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome, which interrupt and reduce the quality of sleep that they do get. And And especially in kids, this can cause some behavioral issues. Some might be sleepy during the day, but sleep-deprived children are especially prone to acting hyperactive and impulsive or have trouble focusing when they're tired out. And some researchers suggest that even in adults with ADHD, hyperactivity is a strategy that the brain might use to keep itself awake. Thus, our chicken and egg question. Is it ADHD that's causing these sleep issues, or could those sleep issues be causing ADHD symptoms? Well, as with many things in psychology so far, there is no consensus. The most likely explanation seems to be that ADHD and sleep interact with each other as bilateral comorbidities. That means they may share a common underlying cause, with symptoms of one exacerbating symptoms of the other. A 2010 study of adults with ADHD looked at the symptoms and sleep patterns of 40 patients. The researchers found that the presence of sleep-onset insomnia, that delay in falling asleep, was more present in those who had ADHD with hyperactivity as opposed to those who are primarily inattentive. This suggests that there may be some weight to the idea that hyperactivity is, at least in some people, the result of poor sleep. But it's not as simple as just going to bed later. In another study from 2013, researchers measured levels of melatonin, a hormone that regulates our circadian rhythm throughout the day. They found that the circadian rhythms of those with ADHD were delayed by about 105 minutes compared to non-ADHD controls. That means they aren't getting that same melatonin-induced sleepiness when daylight started to dim. Instead, they were feeling it almost 2 hours later, pushing back their whole sleep cycle. The researchers have said the next step is to figure out why that is. It might be that at least some people with ADHD are insensitive to melatonin, or maybe even that the receptors in their eyes designed to pick up changes in light may be working atypically. Fortunately, there are treatment options, and therapies that help correct circadian rhythms have already been shown to be effective in addressing symptoms of ADHD. A long-term study of 101 children with ADHD and sleep-onset insomnia looked at the effect taking melatonin supplements had on both their symptoms of ADHD and their sleep patterns. After participating in a randomized control trial, the participants were contacted about 3.5 years down the line to see whether melatonin was still proving helpful for them. They found that 65% of children still used melatonin daily, and that in 88% of cases, it was effective in inducing and maintaining better sleep. 71% reported improvements in behavior, while 61% also saw improvements to their mood. What's more, the study found that 92% of those who stopped taking melatonin saw their delayed sleep onset come back, which adds even more weight to the idea that there's something biologically predisposing those with ADHD toward this altered circadian rhythm. As we mentioned up top, ADHD is a really complex condition, and there are other theories as to what might be going on, and even other approaches to correcting these kinds of sleep patterns beyond just taking melatonin. But research like this shows us that sometimes it's not always a simple case of cause and effect, that different cognitive and biological functions play off of each other, both for better and for worse.
So people diagnosed with ADHD often have trouble sleeping. Now, during your waking hours, you might have noticed that some other humans are particularly wide-eyed. When babies are awake, they tend to stare right into your soul. So on to question number 4. Why is that baby staring at me?
So you're in line at the grocery store and there's a parent holding a baby right in front of you. You're minding your own business, but when you look up, that baby just won't stop staring at you, like you're the most interesting thing on the planet. You might feel like you've grown a second head or like you have chocolate smeared all over your mouth, but in reality, that baby just likes looking at your face, because there's a lot to figure out there. From very early in life, babies seem to like looking at faces, or even just configurations of shapes that look like faces. They also prefer faces they recognize to ones they don't, but they'll sometimes spend a little more time looking at strangers because they're new or different. Faces are important to babies because they're basically completely helpless and have to rely on their caregivers to survive. They need to be able to find and communicate with the people who feed them and change their diapers, and knowing what they look like is an important part of that, even if said communication just involves screaming at the top of their lungs for a while. Babies are also busy taking in huge amounts of information to help them understand the world, and faces can teach them a lot. From our expressions to how our mouths form words, a lot of our communication as humans happens through our faces. In those first few months of life, babies are not only beginning to learn how to recognize their parents or grandparents, but also about all the emotions conveyed by facial expressions. There's a lot to learn. So when a baby is staring at you in a grocery store, her little brain is probably trying to figure out if she knows you and what categories your face fits into, like if you're happy or sad. Now, babies might be born ready to learn from the world around them, but there's still some question about whether looking at faces is an innate characteristic, one you're born with, or if it's influenced by experience. And, like a lot of the age-old nature versus nurture debate, it's a little bit of both. On the nature side, there's some evidence that, within hours to days of being born, babies can copy facial expressions they see, like if you stick out your tongue at them. Not all studies agree with those results, but it's possible that there's an innate ability for finding and mimicking expressions. Other research has found that within hours of birth, babies can discriminate between their mother's face and a stranger's, which might mean their brain is ready to recognize faces without much information. So some evidence suggests that babies may be predisposed to look for information from faces right when they're born. But other studies have shown that it takes experience to get really good at it. Either way, all the time babies and their caregivers spend looking at each other causes rapid improvement in babies' ability to process and recognize faces. Starting around 3 months old, they even begin to group different kinds of faces, like human versus animals and kids versus adults. One especially cool study had babies and adults look at a series of different monkey faces, and also at a bunch of different adult human faces. They found that 6-month-old babies are actually better at differentiating between monkey faces than adults are. But when they're about 9 months old, that ability goes away because of what's called perceptual narrowing, where their perception starts to change based on their experience. Basically, the baby learns that paying attention to the differences in human faces is way more important for its life than the differences in monkey faces. So it should focus more on humans than monkeys. As the brain develops over time, the pathways used to recognize human faces get more efficient, and the ones for monkeys get pruned away. But when researchers expose babies to lots of monkey faces between when they're 6 and 9 months old, they effectively teach their brains that monkeys are important to pay attention to, so they keep that ability for a lot longer. Even though babies are born with some skills, experience helps tell them what parts of the world they should pay attention to, and that shapes how their brain's perception and recognition systems develop. So it's a little bit of nature and a little bit of nurture that goes into that cute, big-eyed baby staring at you. And yeah, in that moment, your face might just be the most interesting thing on the planet. But don't rule out the possibility that you might have a little chocolate on your face too.
Okay, so that baby really is staring at you, but at least it puts you in a better mood to look back into those big round eyes. Evolution has tricked us into feeling that way, but it hits different for some of us. And sometimes there's a serious disorder that affects the way we feel about the world around us. If you've experienced depression or know someone who has, you might have asked burning question number 5. What are the lesser known symptoms of depression?
Hopefully by now we all know that depression is about more than sadness. But even if your idea of depression also includes things like hopelessness or apathy, what about irritability or anger? Does depression make you think of overwhelming guilt? What about memory loss? Because those are all symptoms too. There's a lot we still don't understand about depression, especially when it comes to what's happening on the cellular level. But we know that when it comes to the experience of depression, the disorder often shows itself in the form of unhealthy psychological processes. It turns out that some of those processes, specifically self-blame and rumination, can lead to symptoms people might not realize are signs of depression. And that's too bad, because the result is that we misunderstand those who are suffering from it, sometimes including ourselves. Freud, wrong as he was about a lot of things, pointed out that depression was different from simple sadness because it was associated with guilt. And today, psychologists consider self-blame a key symptom of depression. When something bad happens, depressed people tend to blame themselves and see it as a reflection of their self-worth as a whole. An example researchers sometimes use is that if you fail at a sports match, it means you're a total failure. What's weird is that this only applies to yourself. Depressed people don't usually assign blame to others in the same way. Turns out the unusual amount of guilt and the only applying it to yourself might come from 2 regions of the brain that don't activate together the way they should. In a 2012 study, researchers scanned the brains of 25 people who'd previously had depression and 22 people who didn't. When the people who'd never been depressed read descriptions of themselves doing something wrong, it activated both the part of their brain associated with guilt and the part that deals with morality and what's socially appropriate. In people who'd been depressed, that second part wasn't activated as strongly. This was a small study, so we can't draw too many conclusions from it, but based on the results, the authors suggested that people who are more prone to depression don't get an accurate picture of what they did wrong, so they just feel guilty about everything. So that's one unhealthy thought pattern that can cause symptoms beyond plain old sadness or apathy. Another is rumination, and it is a big one. Rumination is basically brooding, usually unintentionally. Part of problem solving involves analyzing the factors surrounding the problem, and that applies to negative emotional experiences too. But rumination takes that way too far. It's getting stuck thinking about everything that led to and resulted from a negative experience, and it's strongly linked to both depression and anxiety. It can also explain some of the less straightforward signs of depression, like memory problems. Of all the symptoms of depression, memory problems might be the most surprising because we tend to classify depression as emotional and memory as a more mechanical part of the mind. But this is just a false dichotomy. That's not how the brain works. Depressive disorders often include problems with cognitive function, the ability to clearly understand, process, and respond to information. And researchers think that it has a lot to do with rumination eating up all your brain power. You need cognitive resources to pay attention and remember things. And when people with depression are using those resources to brood, they have trouble redirecting them toward the task at hand. They end up struggling with episodic memory, which is the recollection of specific events that happened to you, and working memory, which is how you hold on to information that you're currently using to process other information. Those are both pretty important. It becomes a vicious cycle where the only way to break out of this pattern of rumination is to redirect your mental resources towards something that might make you feel better. But that's exactly what rumination makes it so much harder to do. So people get stuck. Rumination can also lead to another common symptom of depression, anger and irritability, which appears in more than half of patients, although it's only used to diagnose the disorder in kids and teens. But it can be a sign of particularly severe depression. At its core, rumination is a coping strategy people use to help regulate their emotions. It's just not a very good one. Instead of feeling better when people brood on something that made them angry, they tend to spend more time angry. We still have more to learn about how unhealthy thought patterns like self-blame and rumination contribute to depression and its symptoms, but as we study them, we're discovering that they can explain a lot. And there's some good news here too. Self-blame may have to do with brain regions not activating the way they should, and rumination may feel like getting stuck. But researchers point out that unhealthy thought patterns like these are exactly what psychotherapy is meant to help with. Cognitive behavioral therapy especially is designed to identify the connections between thought patterns and behaviors and reshape those thought patterns in a healthier way. So yes, depression is a complicated, difficult illness, but there are therapies and treatments that can help. And recognizing the different ways depression manifests itself is an important step toward getting that help and doing this research.
Depression can be debilitating, and hopefully in the near future, we'll have better interventions to cope with those ruminating cycles. Because for now, and on an entirely different note, we're using a lot of our knowledge of brains for much less noble things like convincing customers to empty their wallets. So burning question number 6 asks, how do restaurants use psychology to make you spend more money?
Whenever you go out for dinner or drinks, just know this. Your brain is being hacked. Like with most businesses, the goal is to make money, so it kind of makes sense that restaurants and bars would do whatever they can to get you to spend more of it. But there are a lot more ways they can manipulate you than you might realize. From the adjectives on the menu to the size of the plates, establishments can use all kinds of psychological tricks to influence your behavior. Some of them are so hardwired that even after you watch this video, you still might be fooled. But at least, if you know what's happening, there's a chance you can take back control. The mind hacking begins with the menu. For example, have you ever noticed that a lot of restaurants list prices as just plain numbers? They'll just be like a 15 next to the crab cakes with no dollar sign or any other indication that it's a price. That's not an aesthetic choice. Studies have shown that people spend more when menus don't have dollar signs, probably because it keeps you from thinking about how much money your order will cost. There's also a bit of thought that goes into how the items are listed. The options aren't hamburger or baked fish. Instead, they're described as Joe's meaty burger or succulent Italian fillet. That is because researchers have found that adding colorful descriptions can increase sales by up to 27%. So you might want to translate the choices in your head before you decide what to order. Restaurants and bars can also influence both how much you spend and how much you consume by using glasses and dishes with certain shapes and sizes. One thing they can do is vary the size of their dishes to take advantage of what's known as the Delboeuf illusion, where two identical circles look different based on the size of the circles around them. Not to be confused with the LaBeouf illusion, where two identical circles are actually props in a short experimental film. In the Delboeuf illusion, if one of the circles is surrounded by a third circle that's just a little bit bigger, the inside circle will look larger than its twin. But if the outside circle is much larger, the inside circle will look smaller. Since food on a plate is essentially a circle of stuff surrounded by the circle of the plate's edge, this illusion can make the same portion look bigger depending on the size of the plate. A 2012 study in the journal Consumer Research confirmed this by showing that people overestimate portions when they're using large plates, serving themselves more than they really wanted. With small plates, they serve themselves less. The Delboeuf illusion is so convincing that studies have found you'll actually feel more full when you eat a meal from a smaller dish. That's why all-you-can-eat buffets tend to keep their plateware small, so you think you're eating more when you really aren't. Meanwhile, restaurants where you pay based on your order tend to serve their entrees on large platters, hoping to convince you that you still have room for dessert. There's also a lot they can do with glassware. Research has shown that people are willing to pay much more for drinks if you match their expectations when it comes to the shape of the glass. Because of cultural influences, we tend to think that some drinks simply belong in certain glasses, like a rounder, larger glass for red wines than for whites. And when there's a mismatch, that creates cognitive dissonance, the psychological stress we feel when a situation leads to conflicts between our attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. You might not think of drinking hot chocolate from a water glass as something that would cause psychological anguish, but it does, which means we find the overall experience less pleasant and we don't want to pay as much for it. Certain shapes can also get you to drink faster. In one study published in PLOS One in 2012, researchers found that we drink beer faster from curved glasses than from straight ones. That's probably because our brains tend to judge how much liquid is left based on how far up the glass it reaches, even if the glass is much wider at the top. So with a curved glass, it's harder for you to pace yourself, and by the time you think you finished half your beer, you're actually much more than halfway through. You might end up finishing the beer much faster than you wanted, and the faster you drink, the faster you need a refill. We also tend to think tall, skinny glasses contain more than short, fat ones, even when they don't. Studies have found that we pour more into short, fat glasses and we drink more from them, up to 88% more. That might come from what's known as the horizontal-vertical illusion, where vertical lines seem longer than horizontal ones. Psychologists aren't totally sure why this illusion works, but it might be because our visual field is wider than it is tall. So like a line of the same length takes up a greater percentage of what we see vertically than it does horizontally, which makes us think it's bigger. Restaurants can even influence the way your food or drink tastes based on how they serve it to you. One tactic uses what's known as shape symbolism, where we associate roundness with sweetness and angles with bitterness. Like with the horizontal-vertical illusion, we're not sure why this is, but it's possible that we conflate bitterness and physical sharpness because they can both be signs of danger. Whatever the reason, shape symbolism makes us perceive chocolate cut into rounds as sweeter than the exact same bar cut into chunks, or beer from a curved glass as fruitier. And that's just the beginning. A lot of flavor manipulation comes from a phenomenon called sensation transference, where we transfer the properties of the plateware or utensil to the food we eat from it. So for example, if you want to make soda taste cooler and more refreshing, you can put it in a cool colored container, a tip that Pepsi took to heart. Even the heft of your cutlery can make a difference. Since we automatically associate weight with quality, we'll think yogurt tastes better when we're eating it with a silver spoon than when we eat it with a plastic one. And of course, as Iron Chef taught me, plating also matters. In one study, researchers presented 60 people with a salad of the exact same ingredients, tossed, neatly sorted, or arranged to look like a famous Kandinsky painting. Before they even tried it, participants said they knew that they liked the artistic salad more, and ultimately, they rated it 29% tastier than the other salads. So if you're trying to reduce how much you eat and drink, or how much you spend, you might want to keep an eye out for some of these tricks the next time you go to eat or meet up at the bar with your friends, because practically everything about that place is trying to sell you something.
Now, that last question was pretty wild. There are all sorts of mind-bending tricks we can pull on our minds. But if you think restaurants are manipulating your brain, just you wait. Because the question you're most eager to know the answer to is, what does pornography do to your brain?
For better or worse, the internet brings people together from distant corners of the world and has information on every conceivable topic. And of course, that includes porn. There's some debate about how much of the internet is actually pornographic content, but if you look for it, you'll find it. So, how does it affect people's brains, attitudes, and behaviors? The short answer is, it's complicated and there's a lot we don't know, but we have studied some of the risks and yes, even possible benefits of watching pornography. So some of these studies talk about disturbing behaviors like sexual violence and rape, just in case you would like to avoid those things. Most research on pornography is correlational. There aren't volunteers who get randomly assigned to watch a bunch of explicit videos to see what happens to their brains. Instead, lots of studies involve surveys asking people about their behaviors and traits in addition to how much porn they watch. On top of that, everyone who participates needs to consent to being in a study about pornography, which might mean some people self-select out of this. All that to say, we can't be sure if these findings apply to everyone or even most people, but they're a start. Some research has found that watching a lot of pornography might reflect differences in people's brains, especially in a part called the striatum. The striatum is involved in reward processing and consistently gets activated during sexual arousal, among other regions. Sexual arousal is a workout for a lot of your brain. 2 MRI studies tested about 70 male participants by showing them sexy pictures, and the men who felt their pornography use was addictive or problematic had more activity in the ventral striatum compared to those who didn't. Another study found that how much porn men watched was negatively correlated with the size of a part of the striatum called the right caudate, as well as the connectivity between the striatum and other parts of the brain. The researchers of that study say it's possible that people who watch a lot of pornography stimulate this reward system a lot and actually rewire their brain to need more stimulation. But they also note that these brain differences might not be caused by porn. In other words, people with a smaller striatum may need more stimulation to experience pleasure and seek out more pornography. With this kind of correlational research, you can't really tell which of the two it is. Another question that comes up a lot is whether viewing pornography can be cathartic, basically a safe outlet for certain emotions. For instance, psychologists have tried to study how it affects aggression. If you look at the general pattern across the US as pornography has become easier to access over the past few decades, rates of violent crime like rape have gone down. And there's a similar pattern if you look at when pornography has become widely available in other countries too. But like we mentioned before, this is just a correlation, and not all studies show this link. For example, a 2016 meta-analysis in the Journal of Communication looked at 22 different studies that asked people about their porn viewing and self-reported sexual aggression, things like using force, verbal harassment, or other threatening behaviors. And they found that more porn viewing was related to higher levels of verbal and physical sexual aggression, particularly if the porn had violent content. This suggests that behavioral modeling might be at work, that people who see a behavior in others, even on a screen, are more likely to do it themselves. So psychologists have tried to make sense of these contradictory data. One 2012 study published in the Journal of Criminal Justice might help shed some light. The relationship between porn and aggression could have to do with timing. The researchers asked over 600 adult men who were convicted of sex crimes about their history of watching pornography. They found that regularly watching pornography during adolescence was linked with more severe crimes committed as adults, including more humiliation of their victims. So maybe early exposure to aggressive sexual behavior played a part in that. And if the convicts had reported viewing porn just before their offense, their crimes were less severe, so catharsis may have been involved. But there are also lots of factors that lead to violent crime, so again, without causal evidence, we don't know if or how pornography is directly linked. Plus, the sample sizes of studies like that are relatively small because most people don't commit violent crimes. It's a little easier to measure something like sexism, since anyone can report their attitudes about men and women, and do all the time. It's the internet. According to 2 studies published in the Journal of Sex Research in 2015 and 2017 that looked at the habits of tens of thousands of Americans, using pornography is associated associated with more egalitarian views, things like wanting women in the workplace and in positions of power. But the story is different when it comes to rape myths, like the idea that what someone's wearing can excuse violence against them. Surveys of hundreds of college students have found that men and women who view porn, especially violent porn, are more likely to believe rape myths. Finally, when it comes to your overall well-being, several studies suggest that whether porn is good or bad for you may depend on whether you think it is. One study of over 2,000 people found that watching porn was linked with an increase in self-reported symptoms of depression, but that effect was mainly seen in the 10% who watched despite their moral opposition to it. The researchers supposed that those people were distressed by the dissonance between their moral ideals and their actions. For those who weren't morally opposed, only the people who watched pornography like several times a week or more reported more symptoms of depression. And the researchers figured the opposite could be happening here. These people may be depressed and using porn to cope. So there do seem to be some risks associated with watching a lot of pornography, but it might not be all bad. More than anything, we need more research to really know if and how much it affects us, because psychology and the human brain and our behavior is complicated.
That really is our most popular psych video. And it's possible that over the years, another video will gain popularity and change up the list. But if that happens, you can take all the credit for popularizing it, because we'll be posting all of our new psych videos to the main SciShow channel starting in 2022. And this transition will bring more burning psychology questions to more people. So thank you so much for your vision in creating the SciShow Psych channel and for your support over the last 5 years. Whether it's here or on our main SciShow channel, we can't wait to keep learning with you.